for today's topic, we are going to be continuing the theme that we discussed on our shir on Friday, but from a slightly different angle. So for those who are with us on Erev Shabbos, this will be a bit of chazar, a little bit of repetition, but for those who weren't with us, I will just go through some of the main details. So I'm going to bring up a slide which shows how the structure of the Beis Hamikdash was not on a level, flat ground, but rather was built ascending up the mountain, ascending up Har HaBayis. So if you have a look at the picture on your screen, Har HaBayis was initially a mountain, as its name suggested, Har HaMoriah, the mountain on which the Akedah took place, where Avram was going to offer his son Yitzchak. Also, in addition, this mountain was the place from which Adam Harishon was created. His body was formed from the earth, from the site of the future Mizbeach. Tradition tells us that this is also where Noach built an altar after the flood, and it is also the site where Yaakov Avinu had his dream of the ladder ascending to heaven up to Shamayim. So the ground, the bedrock of Har HaBayis was a very holy site. And when it came to build the Beis Hamikdash, what they did was they built a series of retaining walls around the mountain and filled that in. And when they did so, they did it in a unique way to avoid any issues of tumah. Because of course, if there is a body buried within the ground or any bones or part of a body, that can create a state of ritual impurity. And the Beis Hamikdash had to be free of any impurity. And therefore they built it in such a way that there were hollowed arches which create an oihel, an interposition that blocks any tumah, any parts of the body that might be buried under the ground. And then they built a nice level plateau. However, as we discussed in last week's shir, the tip of the mountain, the Azara, the courtyard, and the Beis Hamikdash itself was not built on the flat surface of Har HaBayis. That flat surface was left as a big open plaza where people would congregate, people would gather. But the actual Beis Hamikdash structure itself, from the Azara and onwards, was built on the slope of the mountain itself, as such that a person would have to ascend various stairs as they moved from level to level within the Beis Hamikdash. So we mentioned that from Har HaBayis, from the Temple Mount, the nice flat surface, to ascend to the Ezras Nashim, so there were a series of 12 steps. To then ascend from the Ezras Nashim into the primary Azara of the Beis Hamikdash, the primary Azara of the Beis Hamikdash, where the sacrifices would be brought, where the altar stood, there were another series of stairs, this time 15 steps leading to the Shar HaNikanor. Then there were additional steps of the Duchan, where the Kohanim would stand to bless the people. And then finally another 12 steps, which would lead up to the Heichal, in which the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy and the Holy of Holies, were situated. But they were all on an equal plateau, on an equal level. So that's the cross section that you could see depicted. So it was not nice and flat, but anyone going into the Beis Hamikdash, the further you went in, you had to climb step after step after step, until, as we mentioned last time, one was standing 22 amos, some 11 meters above the original level of Har HaBayis. So we're going to continue this discussion now and try to come to some understanding of why it was built in this way. So the Rambam, in the beginning of chapter 6 of the Halachos of Beis HaBechira, says as follows: Hamikdash kuloi loihaya b'mishar. The Mikdash, the Beis Hamikdash, was not built all on one flat level. Ela b'mayla hahar, was built up the slope of the mountain. And the question is, why does the Rambam write this in a negative sense? Why does he write that the Mikdash was built not on flat ground, but rather on the ascent of the mountain? He should have just said simply that the Mikdash was built on the ascent of the mountain. Why is it written in this negative form? And to understand this, we have to look at the prototype, the forerunner to the Beis Hamikdash, which was, of course, the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle which accompanied the Jewish people when they were in the desert. Now, in the Mishkan, everything was all on one level, of course. It was something which is portable. They didn't have stairs. It was not built up on any mountains, but wherever they camped in the desert, the entire Mishkan was all on one level. So the Azara, the outer courtyard, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, was all on one plane. And since this is the forerunner, the prototype for every subsequent Beis Hamikdash, one might have thought that the same applies to the Beis Hamikdash, that the Beis Hamikdash should also be constructed all on one equal level. And therefore the Rambam has to come to negate that and say the Beis Hamikdash was not built, B'mishar was not built on one flat level, that rather was built ascending up the mountain itself. So the question is why? If the Mishkan was built in such a way that it was entirely all on one plane, why was the Beis Hamikdash built in this way, as we saw on the diagram, where it elevated and one had to ascend from level to level to level? So to understand this, we need to look and understand a little bit about the natures of these various levels and spaces within the Beis Hamikdash itself. Whilst the Beis Hamikdash was all holy, the entire Beis Hamikdash was a holy place, nonetheless, each various level of the Beis Hamikdash had higher and higher degrees of kedusha, of holiness. And that higher degree of holiness in each subsequent area reflected itself in a number of areas. Number one, it reflected itself on who was allowed access to each of those levels. So for example, someone who was impure was not allowed into certain areas, but may have been allowed in others. Kohanim were allowed into certain areas, and non-Kohanim were allowed at other times as well. So that's one area where the differences in Kedusha of holiness from level to level expressed itself. Another area is what was done in each of those areas, what type of avodah was done in those areas, what part of the temple service. And in addition, with the various korbanos, the various sacrifices which would be eaten either by the Kohanim or by the owners of those korbanos, where they could be eaten. So we're going to bring up another slide in a moment. And this is based on the Mishnayos, which tells us that that there are 10 different grades of kedusha, of holiness within Eretz Yisrael itself. Eretz Yisrael is the land which is holier than all other lands. And of course, within Eretz Yisrael, Yerushalayim, the city of Jerusalem, is the most holy of all places, the most holy of all cities. Within Yerushalayim itself, the Har Habayis, the Temple Mountain, is the most holy of places. And then when we come to the Temple Mountain itself, that is where we're going to start our explanation of the various levels within the Beis HaMikdash itself. So the Har Habayis itself, the temple itself, Temple Mountain itself, was less holy than the Azara, for example, the courtyard. And that was reflected in the fact that someone who had Tumas Mace, someone who had impurity from contact to the dead, was allowed to be on Har Habayis. They were allowed to be on the Temple Mount itself. They were just not allowed to go into the area of the Azara. Now that is in contrast to someone who had another form of impurity, such as a Nida or a Zav or a Zava. They had to be relegated. They were not allowed to be on Har Habayis itself. So now we're going to move in. And as we move further in, on Har Habayis itself, there was a soireg. What was the soireg? The Rambam tells us that this was a wall-type structure. It was a lattice work of some form, and that created another border, another boundary as well. The soireg was the point up to which non-Jews were allowed to go. A non-Jew was not permitted to go past this soireg, and indeed, that is why when the Yevanim, the Greeks, came into Yerushalayim, before they eventually desecrated the temple, they made 3 breaches into this soireg, as if to show that that this boundary, which was supposed to distinguish between Jews and non-Jews, they wanted to breach through, they wanted to remove that boundary. So within the soireg was more holy than the rest of the Har Habayis, because whereas on the rest of the Har Habayis, a non-Jew was allowed to be present, but past the soireg, a non-Jew was not allowed to go. Okay, then we go back past the soireg. Within the soireg, we then come to the next level, and that was the Ezras Nashim. The Ezras Nashim, there was no avodah done there. No part of the temple service was actually done there. And as its name suggests, Ezras Nashim, not like Ashur, and Ezras Nashim means only women can be there. Here in the Beis HaMikdash, the Ezras Nashim means an area where women were also allowed to be. And that's where they would dance on Simchas Beis HaShoeva, on Sukkos, and the women would stand on the specially built porticos, galleries, where they would be. But a woman was allowed to be in the Ezras Nashim. Ezras Nashim did not have the holiness of the Azara, and therefore with people with other forms of Tumah, they were allowed to be in the Ezras Nashim, Tumas Mace would be allowed to be there, but a Tvul Yoim was not allowed to be there. And then we come to the actual Azara itself. The Azara itself is the structure of the courtyard itself, where the sacrifices were brought, and in that there were different areas as well. So there was the Ezras Yisrael, the first 11 amas, the first 5.5 meters of that floor space. A Yisrael, an Israelite could be there even if they were not bringing a korban. Then we had the Ezras Kohanim, the area of the Kohanim, where the Kohanim could be at the time when they were not involved in the avodah of the Beis HaMikdash. Then we have Bein Ulam LaMizbeach, between the Beis Hamikdash structure and the Mizbeach was considered more holy. And then, of course, we have the structure itself of the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holy and the holy of holies. So this pretty much parallels the first diagram that we saw, which we'll bring up on the screen again. When we look at the cross section of the Har HaBayis, we see these different areas. So the Har HaBayis, which was the least holy of the spaces within the temple confines, was on the lowest plateau. In order to come up to the Ezra's Nashim, which had a higher degree of holiness, one had to ascend stairs. They climbed up. In order to go from the Ezra's Nashim to the Azara to the Ezra's Yisrael, again, there was a series of stairs because one had to elevate to this next level to a higher degree of holiness. And then in order to enter into the primary Azara where the sacrifices were brought, there were the steps of the Duchan. And finally, in order to enter into the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Heichal itself, there were additional stairs. One needed to elevate again. And the idea is as follows, that the spiritual Kedusha, the spiritual holiness within each area of the Beis HaMikdash itself was reflected in the physical construction of the Beis HaMikdash. That the greater the level of holiness in a spiritual sense, the higher that area was physically. And therefore, as one moved from level to level in greater levels of holiness, they would have to climb the stairs to reach higher and higher and physicality. And with this, we can understand the difference between the Beis HaMikdash and the Mishkan. Why it was that the Mishkan was built all on one plateau, whereas the Beis HaMikdash was built on an ascent, and it would ascend in such a way that the areas physically, geographically, in topography, mirrored the spirituality, the holiness as well. We've discussed in previous shiurim that the purpose of the Mikdash, of the Beis HaMikdash, is b'shachanti b'soicham, to bring godliness into the world. That's what the Beis HaMikdash's primary role was, to bring Hashem's presence in a way that it comes into the world. But there was a difference between the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. The Mishkan was called a temporary dwelling place. It was only a temporary structure, and therefore the influence of the Mishkan on the physicality of the world was minimal. Not only was it minimal, but as soon as, for example, the Mishkan was erected in one place as they traveled, as soon as they dismantled the Mishkan to move on to their next journey, that land where the Mishkan had stood was no longer holy. It was considered as mundane. Just a question that has come now, someone sent in, what about the other Mishkans? We know that when the Jewish people entered into Eretz Yisrael, it was a good few hundred years before they came to the Beis HaMikdash, and and there was a Mishkan, for example, set up in Gilgal, the first stop of the Jewish people. Later was set up in Shiloh, etc., etc. We don't really know for sure. The Beis HaMikdash, that is not discussed anywhere. Those buildings are not really discussed. But the presumption is that they too were semi-permanent and they were semi-temporary. So, for example, in Shiloh there were actual stone walls, which is the idea of permanence, but there were curtains on top as opposed to roof, which is the idea of temporary. So, in terms of the physical structure and the topography, I can't answer that question, but a good question nonetheless. So, the Mishkan was only temporary, and therefore the effect in the physical world was only passing as well. It did not imbue its kedusha, its sanctity, into the bedrock of the earth. But the Beis HaMikdash, which is called the Menucha V'Nachala, the permanent settling dwelling place of the Shekhinah, and once the Beis HaMikdash was built in Yerushalayim, it was forbidden to build a Beis HaMikdash anywhere else other than Har HaBayis. So there was a permanent structure, and so too the godliness which the Beis HaMikdash brought into the world imbued that godliness into the physicality of the world, into the bedrock of the Har HaBayis itself. And therefore, the physical construction of the Beis HaMikdash, the physical layout of the Beis HaMikdash mirrored the spiritual kedusha, holiness of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore just as one ascended spiritually from level to level, so too the Beis HaMikdash ascended physically on the mountain itself from level to level as well. But we'll conclude with the following question. If that is so, then there's a glaring question, and that is, what about the Kodesh HaKadoshim? The Kodesh HaKadoshim was the most holiest space in the Beis HaMikdash entirely. And therefore, you would think, based on our model right now, that as the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur, when he would go from the Kodesh, where the menorah and the Shulchan stood, to go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, you would think that he too should climb a series of stairs to show how the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the holiest of holies, was an even greater level of holiness. And the answer is as follows. all of the various other levels. When one ascended from Harabayis to the Ezras Nashim, which is a higher level of Kedusha, from the Ezras Nashim to Ezras Yisrael, which was a higher level of Kedusha, from there to the Ezras Kohanim, which is a high level of Kedusha, and then to the Heichal itself, a high level of Kedusha, each of those ascents, each jump in spiritual quality, in holiness, was incremental. It was something which was be'erech. It's something which was commensurate or relatable to the former level. That if you were to climb a series of stairs, you would reach the next level. You would reach that next stage. You would reach that next platform. But when we talk about the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, was completely beyond. It was a level of Kedusha which infinitely surpassed all of the other levels of Kedusha within the Beis HaMikdash itself. And therefore, it is not a level of Kedusha that one could attain by climbing more and more rungs. You climb more and more steps and you'll be able to reach it. That might be true for the other areas of the Beis HaMikdash. But the Kodesh HaKadoshim was so infinitely beyond, it was beyond time and space altogether. And that is why our sages teach us that the Aron, which stood in the Holy of Holies, did not take up space. That the Aron had finite physical measures, yet when you measured around it, it was though it did not exist, it did not take up space as well. So because the Kodesh HaKadoshim is a level of holiness which is beyond space entirely and completely beyond everything else, therefore one could not simply ascend stairs to reach that level. In our own personal lives, what is the message? We all try to grow spiritually. That's what we're supposed to do. The neshama, once it comes down to this world, is called a mahalech, someone who journeys and grows. We are supposed to grow in our holiness, in our service of Hashem, in our observance of Torah mitzvahs. Our kedusha is supposed to grow from day to day. But the purpose of creation is to make a dira b'tachtonim, a dwelling place in this physical world. So our sense in holiness, our prayers, our Torah studies, whilst that lifts us up higher and higher spiritually and connects us higher and higher in our relationship to Hashem, that is not the end goal. The end goal is that gets channeled downwards into the bedrock of our lives, into the earthiness of our lives, into the physical dimensions of our lives, that they become reflective and permeated with the spirituality from our spiritual involvements and spiritual pursuits in our lives. And we should be successful in building this world to be that dira b'tachtonim, that dwelling place for Hashem, down here in the physical sense, not up there in the spiritual sense, but permeating the physicality of the world. And when we do that, then we will have the coming of Mashiach, when the entire world, the entire physicality of the world, we will see how it has been filled and imbued with the kedusha, the holiness of all of our Torah and our mitzvahs, and that should happen speedily in our days. So, thank you for joining us for the shir this morning. We continue throughout the week. Everyone is invited to join us again. It was wonderful to have you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.